Crease, thank you for $5. Nomad ELRS have FSK modulation instead of FLRC. Is this new modulation supported by existing receivers? It appears to be the only way to get 1,000 hertz. Yes, if you update the firmware. You have to update the firmware, but the 900 megahertz receivers will support that modulation if you put them on the firmware that supports it.
I don't know. Is that correct?
What do you think? Do you think that's not correct?
I was just digging through old PRs, and it seems like at least at one point that was not correct. But I don't know if it was changed at some point. Because it's K modes now, right? Instead of F modes and D modes. F modes are FLRC, D modes are...
I mean, that FSK modulation is part of the 1121 chip. So any receiver that has an 1121 chip, I guess there were some older 900 megahertz chips, receivers that had a different chip that didn't support, that wasn't the 1121, perhaps. And I don't know if they would support the FSK modes, but I think all the Gemini. So I'll say this: all the Gemini receivers, the dual band Gemini. All the dual band Gemini receivers have an 1121 chip and should support that mode. Many of the 900 megahertz receivers. Let's see. See if I can find a. I don't want the cross receiver though. I want the BR1 receiver. Does this say which chip it has? Does it have an 1121? No, 1276. Okay, so the 1276 may not support that FSK mode. I don't know. I mean, maybe it does.
Just to be clear, 1,000 hertz is already supported on all 2.4 gigahertz devices through F1000. That's a FLRC mode. But if you're talking about FSK 1000, then yeah.
So the 1276 does support FSK mode. Is Captain Bry around? Because I don't know for sure. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Discord. Where are you, Discord? Where can I find Discord? There's Discord. I'm going to ask Captain Bry. He'll know, and he'll probably answer me pretty quickly. Do all 900 megahertz ELRS receivers support the new FSK 1000 hertz modulation, or only 1121 receivers, or some other answer? Okay, we'll see if he gets back to me. I'm as confident as I can be that any 1121 receiver will support that mode, but I could be wrong. Okay. The Nomad doesn't show support for FLRC 1000. That is correct, Crease. The Nomad doesn't support FLRC 1000. It supports FSK 1000, which those two things aren't equivalent, although they're both at 1,000 hertz. FLRC... it's going to have... Does FLRC have longer range than FSK? It feels like it should because it's like newer. I don't know. 2.4 gigahertz definitely supports 1,000 hertz, Crease, but not on the Gemini crossband chips. A 2.4... Yes, no. Okay, and again, where's that table? Where's the table? Radio Master, it was in the GX12 paperwork. Where is it? Come on, buddy. Well, flip me. Where is the where there's an image which has a table of supported... data rates. Oh man, there it is. Compatibility chart. Open image in new tab. There we go. Okay, so Radio Master Ranger is regular 2.4 gigahertz only, using the SX1280 chip. It supports LoRa 50 hertz through 500 hertz, and FLRC 250 hertz through 1000 hertz. That's the 2.4 gigahertz SX1280. Okay? Bandit is SX1270, which operates in 900 megahertz and supports only LoRa and these packet rates. And Nomad, which has the 1121 chip, and this is all Gemini receivers, all crossband Gemini receivers. You could build a 900 megahertz only Gemini receiver using an SX1270, and it would support these. You could build a 2.4 gigahertz only Gemini receiver with an SX1280, and it would support these. But most Gemini being made today are crossband. They do both 2.4 and 900. You can switch between them. Those are going to use the 1121 chip, like the Nomad module and the GX12, and they're going to support these packet rates. And you can see that these packet rates in 2.4 gigahertz, we do not get all the way to 1000 because we don't support FLRC. So if you have a 2.4 gigahertz receiver using an FLRC modulation, well, it should bind. I don't know why it wouldn't bind, because when it's binding, it doesn't know what modulation it's on. Actually, don't know how that works.
It does know what modulation it's on, yes.
The receiver? How does it know?
It doesn't know, but it looks, the transmitter broadcasts a certain set. My understanding from Bry was that the transmitter broadcasts a certain series of packets, and then the receiver picks up that series of packets based on what the modulation rate is. So it only does it if it matches the set of things.
So if the receiver was previously bound at F1000, then the Nomad will not be able to bind to it unless you reset it? That doesn't make it.
I think that's based on the setting in the radio. Because isn't there a setting for that now? If it decides to look, or if it starts on a different modulation rate, remember?
It had the init rate. It used to have the init rate, although that's gone in 3.4, 3.5.
Yeah, init rate is what it's looking for first, right? So it scrolls through all the options. That's the point.
Right. But the receiver, when the receiver goes into bind mode, binding has to have, I would think that binding would happen at, LoRa 50, because it's a universal packet rate.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the binding is different than just broadcasting.
It doesn't make sense to me that binding would depend on, it doesn't make sense to me that they would break binding in this way, right? If they know that a Nomad 1121 can't do F1000, then that shouldn't be possible to leave a 2.4 gig 1280 receiver in a state where it is not able to bind to a Nomad module, because they can absolutely bind. They just can't use the FLRC packet rates. So that seems like it would be a silly decision for the devs to make. And I wonder if we're getting the full story.
My previous understanding of the process has always been, and it may be different now with this firmware, but it has always been that the receiver always scrolls through every single possible packet rate over and over again to look for the transmitter signal. It just starts at a different spot depending on where it was last bound. It may take a minute to get through all these sets, because it has to go through every single set of packet rates it can possibly bind to look for the TX broadcasting something it can catch.
Yeah, but that's
as long as they're on the same binding phrase.
But that's not binding. That's initial connection. Binding is a whole separate behavior that we really don't know anything about. And I think I've answered the question. The question is, do only 1121 support the FSK mode? In fact, I'm going to delete this question.
But okay, so you're saying binding where you're doing some kind of binding mode, but I'm saying binding where you put binding phrase into both devices like you normally do with ExpressLRS.
Oh, if you put the bind phrase in them using the Wi-Fi interface, again, the 2.4 gig receiver will start at F1000, but then it'll cycle back through the other ones and will eventually pick it up. 100%.
Unless something has changed, that's how it's always worked in ExpressLRS. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. So we can clearly see from this table that the FSK modes are only supported on the 1121 chipset. And that is generally going to be the Gemini crossband receivers, not the dedicated 900 megahertz receivers. The dedicated 900 megahertz receivers will probably have the 1270 chipset and not do the FSK modes. I got to tell you, I think that the Gemini crossband is like gonna be the way forward for Express LRS, especially in the handset. Like, I don't know if there's much benefit to buying a crossband receiver for a typical person, because a typical person is either going to want extended range, in which case they're going to want a dual 900 receiver, or they're going to want lower latency, in which case they're going to want a dual 2.4 gig receiver. But on the handset, the ability to go back and forth like that is massive. And you're not even giving up that much. Like, you're giving up the FLRC packet rates on the 2.4 gig side, and you're giving up the 25 and the D50 packet rate on the 900 megahertz side. That's not that big a deal, you know?
You're getting no difference between K1000 and F1000 to the normal user, right? Like, they're not going to know the difference.
I think the range is different. I think I can tell you the resistance to interference is absolutely different. FSK modulation is much more susceptible to interference than LoRa. And, I don't know about FLRC.
They do FEC. Yeah, they do FEC on it. So I think what they've said is FSK. Bry's in the chat, he can correct me, but I think FSK plus FEC, forward error correcting, is like equivalent to FLRC in this situation, or at least that's what the wiki says. I don't know if that's correct.
Okay. I didn't know that. I'm learning that, right? I'm just now learning that. Maybe Captain Bry can comment on the performance of K1000 versus F1000.
Also, he says binding does happen at 50 hertz, like you said. So if you initiate binding, like you talked about with the binding mode, then it does go to 50, but on both devices. And then, yes, we always cycle through all modes regardless of init rate, like you said.
So you should never get in a situation where, like, a Nomad module can't bind to a Ranger because the Ranger is, like, in FLRC mode or something, and they won't talk. That should never happen. What's the relative performance of FSK 1000 versus FLRC 1000, Bry? Like, the gist of the question is, if I'm a pilot and I buy a Nomad module and I just make that my daily driver, or I buy a GX12 and I make that my daily driver, what am I giving up by losing access to those FLRC modes? Am I really giving anything up? Because we still have DK500, we have full 200.
Well, okay.
We're losing D500,
I think
D250.
The original question came out of this. I have a bunch of 2.4 gigahertz receivers. I want to buy the Nomad. So that means I don't get 1,000 hertz, right? And that the answer is yes.
Correct. If you have a bunch of 2.4 gig receivers and you buy a Nomad, you don't get any of the FLRC packet rates, and you don't get 1,000 hertz. You would need to buy an 1121, you would need to buy a Gemini crossband receiver to get the K1000. You would need to swap your receivers. So that's a really good point. Valid. I think the chat's behind, or Bry is behind. He's not answering yet. Anyway, good talk. Oh, he says, you're losing compatibility with receivers that aren't 1121 if you want to do any of the FLAs, but the DK modes are pretty equivalent to the F modes. So there you go. Crease, you don't need to buy all new receivers. Well, Crease. Just buy a Ranger module. Buy a 2.4 gig module. If you already have a bunch of 2.4 gig receivers and that 1,000 hertz is important for racing, which I agree it is, don't buy a bunch of receivers. Buy a module, and then you're fine.
Aren't the racers? I mean, has it changed? Weren't all the racers racing on D modes before?
That's also true. The D modes have much better resistance to interference, and racers were saying that was a significant improvement in LQ when running a D mode. So instead of running F1000, they would be running D500. Nevertheless, you also can't bind in D500 mode with a Nomad.
Right. True.
Who wants a module hanging off the back of their radio? Yeah, that means GX12 plus a module. And if you don't like that, then yes, you need to buy a Gemini crossband receiver for all your racing drones, and then use K1000 or DK500. DK500 would be the one to use. Yeah. So. And Captain Bryce says the question of F1000 versus D500 is up in the air. Anyway. The idea is that since the D mode transmits each packet twice, you get increased noise resistance and better. And if you've got a Gemini, it's doing even better than that because it's transmitting on different hopping patterns. So anyway, good talk. That's the kind of nerdy shit you guys come for, isn't it? Hell yeah.